When you picture Iran, you probably picture this: men in suits burning a flag, a masked man in a mosque calling for death to a country he has never seen, a woman getting arrested for showing her hair. That is the Iran that 15 years of news coverage has built inside your head. I want to show you a different Iran. Not because the regime isn't real, it is. Not because the fear isn't real, it is. But because if you actually want to understand why this regime exists, why 45 years of protests haven't been enough to remove it, and why this conflict keeps escalating instead of ending, you have to go back further than a mosque and further than a revolution. You probably think the story of Iran and the West is a story about religion. It is not. It is a story about oil, geography, and a 200-year-old habit that outside powers never managed to break, the habit of deciding Iran's future for it. And once you see that pattern, you will never watch the news about Iran the same way again. This is that pattern. Watch closely. It shows up again and again and again. Our story starts almost 200 years before the Islamic Republic ever existed, in a country that most Westerners at the time didn't even call Iran. They called it Persia. In the early 1800s, Persia sat wedged between two expanding empires. To the north, the Russian Empire was pushing south, hungry for a warm water port it could use in winter, when its northern harbors froze solid. To the east, the British Empire was terrified of losing its most valuable possession on earth, India. Persia wasn't a target because anyone particularly wanted to live there. It was a target because of where it sat on a map. British officials at the time openly called the land east of Persia the key to India, meaning whoever controlled it controlled the gateway to Britain's most profitable colony. Losing Persia to Russian influence wasn't just a loss. It was, in British eyes, an existential threat. So Russia and Britain did something that would repeat itself for the next 2 centuries. They fought over Persia without asking Persia. Russia crushed Persian forces in 2 brutal wars and forced the ruling Qajar dynasty to sign treaties stripping Persia of its own coastline rights on the Caspian Sea, exempting Russian merchants from Persian law, and, almost unbelievably, forcing Persia to pay Russia reparations for losing the war Russia started. Britain, watching nervously, poured money and pressure into the country from the other direction to keep Russia contained. Persia's kings, called shahs, found themselves running a country they didn't fully control. So they did the only thing that kept the lights on. They started selling pieces of it. Not land, industries, telegraph lines, railroads, banking rights, customs collection. Entire national monopolies sold to foreign investors in exchange for cash the Shah needed to survive. This wasn't corruption in the cartoonish sense. It was 2 empires squeezing a smaller country until it had nothing left to sell but itself. In 1890, the Shah sold Britain something the Persian people actually felt in their daily lives: a 50-year monopoly on tobacco. In a country where nearly every household grew, sold, or smoked tobacco, this meant every cigarette now had to pass through a British-controlled middleman. For the first time, ordinary Persians, not just political elites, rose up. Shopkeepers stopped selling. Clerics issued religious rulings against smoking. Even the women of the royal household reportedly stopped smoking in protest. It worked. The Shah was forced to cancel the deal. That protest planted a seed. Persians realized that when they moved together, they could force even a king to back down. 15 years later, that seed became a revolution. In 1905, Persians rose up demanding a constitution, a parliament, and real limits on the Shah's power to sell their country out from under them. Against enormous odds, it worked. Persia got one of the first constitutional parliaments in the entire Middle East. Russia hated this. A Persian parliament that could say no to foreign concessions was bad for business. So in 1911, Russian troops marched into the capital, surrounded the parliament building, and opened fire with artillery, killing lawmakers and revolutionaries where they stood. This is the first time in our story that a foreign power uses violence to protect its interests inside Iran. Remember this moment. It will not be the last. Then, in 1908, something happened that turned Persia from a strategic buffer zone into one of the most fought-over pieces of real estate on the planet. A British prospector named William Knox D'Arcy struck oil. Here's a detail almost nobody knows. D'Arcy's original deal with the Shah gave Persia just 16% of the company's profits, and Persia had no right to ever audit the books. The company built its own refinery at a port called Abadan, and within a few decades, that single refinery was the largest oil refinery on the entire planet. The man who orchestrated Britain's purchase of a controlling stake in that oil company was a young government minister who would later become one of the most famous leaders in modern history, Winston Churchill. Churchill was converting the Royal Navy's warships from coal to oil, and he needed a guaranteed supply. He would later write that the deal handed Britain, quote, "a prize from fairyland beyond our wildest dreams." That fairyland was Iranian oil, and the country producing it was still being paid a fraction of what it was worth, with no say in the accounting. Then World War I broke out, and Iran, despite officially declaring neutrality, became a battlefield anyway, simply because its oil was too valuable for the great powers to leave alone. Historians estimate close to 2 million Iranians died during this period, largely from war-driven famine and disease, in a war their own government never chose to join. By the 1920s, Iranians were exhausted from 100 years of being a chessboard for foreign empires. A military officer named Reza Khan seized power, crowned himself the new Shah, and set out to drag Iran into the 20th century by force, building railroads, universities, and a modern army, banning the veil, and demanding the world finally call his country by its own name, Iran, not the Western label of Persia. But when World War II broke out and Reza Shah tried, again, to stay neutral and keep German engineers in the country, Britain and the now Soviet Russia repeated the exact same move they'd made 100 years earlier. They invaded, forced him off his own throne, and exiled him, replacing him with someone far more cooperative, his 22-year-old son. That son's name was Mohammad Reza Shah. Hold on to that name. He is the man at the center of everything that happens next. By the early 1950s, Iranians had had enough. Britain was still pulling colossal profits from Iranian oil, while Iran itself got a fraction of the money and none of the say. Parliament tried to renegotiate for a fair 50-50 split. Britain refused. So a fierce, French-educated nationalist lawyer named Mohammad Mosaddeq stood up in Parliament and made an argument that terrified two empires at once. Iran shouldn't be negotiating for a bigger slice. Iran should own the entire oil industry outright. It worked. In 1951, Mosaddeq became prime minister, and Iran nationalized its own oil industry for the first time in history. Britain panicked. They tried economic warfare first, a global boycott of Iranian oil, enforced by warships blocking the Persian Gulf. When that didn't break Mossaddeq's popularity, Britain went to Washington with a story. Mosaddeq, they claimed, was a communist sympathizer who might hand Iran's oil to the Soviets. It wasn't really true, but it landed at exactly the right moment, the height of the Cold War, with a brand new American president desperate to look tough on communism anywhere on Earth. So in 1953, the CIA, working with British intelligence, launched a covert operation reportedly funded with the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars today to remove a democratically elected leader from power. Newspapers were secretly paid to turn public opinion against him. Paid organizers filled the streets with anti-Mossaddeq crowds. The operation was run in part by a CIA officer named Kermit Roosevelt, Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. The first attempt to remove Mosaddeq actually failed, and the Shah briefly fled the country in fear. But the CIA regrouped, got enough of the Iranian military to switch sides, and this time it worked. Mosaddeq was arrested, tried, and placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. The Shah flew back into the country not as Iran's chosen leader, but as the man two foreign intelligence agencies had just reinstalled. This is the moment Iranians point to again and again when they talk about why they don't trust the West. It's not an abstract grievance. It's a specific, documented year, 1953. The one time Iran tried democracy on its own terms, and two foreign powers erased it in a matter of weeks. For the next 25 years, the reinstalled Shah ruled with American backing, oil money, and an iron fist. He built roads, schools, and a rapidly growing middle class. He also built one of the most feared secret police forces in the world, trained with CIA assistants, used to imprison and torture anyone who criticized him. He gave American personnel in Iran legal immunity from Iranian law, an eerie echo of the exact same demand Russia had made over a century earlier. The Shah spent staggering sums of oil wealth on palaces and lavish parties, while ordinary Iranians watched their cost of living rise. And the loudest, angriest critic of all of this wasn't a politician. It was a religious scholar in exile named Ruhollah Khomeini, whose sermons, smuggled into the country on cassette tapes because he'd been banished, accused the Shah of selling Iran's independence, first to the British, then to the Americans. By 1978, protest had spread beyond religious circles into every part of Iranian society. Shopkeepers, oil workers, students, intellectuals, people who agreed on almost nothing except one thing: the Shah had to go. When oil workers went on strike, it crippled the government's finances almost overnight. In January 1979, the Shah fled the country for the last time. Weeks later, Khomeini returned to Tehran, to crowds in the millions. The revolution had won. Here's what most coverage of Iran gets wrong. It treats the Islamic Republic as if it's simply a religious government. It's not just that. It's an engineering project built specifically to make sure what happened in 1953 could never happen again. Khomeini's new constitution placed unelected religious bodies above the elected government. Iranians do vote for a parliament, for a president, but every candidate first has to be approved by religious councils appointed by an unelected supreme leader. Political scientists call this a filtered democracy. The appearance of a vote, engineered so it can never produce an outcome the system doesn't already approve of. On top of that, the regime built an entirely parallel military, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, with its own army, navy, and air force, whose loyalty is to the regime itself, not just the country's borders. Add to that a nationwide volunteer militia network reaching into nearly every neighborhood, and you have a system explicitly designed to survive coups, assassinations, and uprisings. As one Iran expert has put it, if you eliminate 100 of this regime's top officials, 100 more are already in line to replace them. That is not an accident. That is the entire design. This is also why, for decades, the regime funded militias across the wider region and pushed hard toward nuclear capability, not primarily out of religious prophecy, but as the ultimate insurance policy against the one thing this country's leadership fears more than anything else: foreign powers deciding its future again. That fear-driven design is exactly what's colliding with the world right now. For years, Israel has treated Iran's nuclear program and its regional militia network as existential threats, and in recent months, that tension has turned into open military conflict, with the United States drawn in directly. Different governments, analysts, and news outlets disagree sharply on what happens next, whether pressure and strikes can force real change, or whether a system built for exactly this kind of pressure will simply absorb it and dig in, the way it has for 45 years. Reasonable, well-informed people land in very different places on this, and it's genuinely still unfolding. But there's one thing that gets lost in almost every headline: the people. Surveys have suggested that a large majority of Iranians, some estimates put it at around 80%, do not support this regime. The people living inside this story are not the regime that rules them, any more than any population is simply identical to its government. For 200 years, ordinary Iranians have been caught in the middle of a fight between their own rulers and outside powers, with almost no say in either. That, more than any single ideology, is the real story of Iran. If there's one thing I want you to walk away with, it's this: the next time you see a headline about Iran, don't just ask what the regime is doing. Ask what 200 years of outside powers taught this country to expect from the rest of the world. That's the pattern, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next